Welcome to Northern Mystery Archives. Here we don't soften the truth and we don't skip the details. We investigate the forgotten files from the far north of Canada, the disappearances that were quietly shelved, the settlements that faded from every map, the transmissions that were never meant to be heard again. In this channel, nothing is hidden. Every fragment, every silence, every erased trail is examined with the seriousness these cases deserved but never received. If you value cold, atmospheric, minimalist investigations into the unexplained wilderness of the North, you're in the right place. Subscribe, stay close, and step with us into the files they hoped no one would ever revisit. Below, we will be speaking about the case titled exactly as provided, Mira Ellwood, Winter, 1946, Never Explained, Frontier Settlement Case. It all began when a single handwritten ledger surfaced in a provincial archive basement during a routine inventory cataloging session in the late 1970s. The ledger contained supply records, weather observations, and personnel notes for a remote frontier settlement that no longer appeared on any official territorial map. The settlement's name was Mira Ellwood. According to the fragmented entries, it had been established somewhere along the northwestern edge of the boreal shield, positioned near a series of interconnected lakes that froze solid from October through late April. The ledger ended abruptly in February of 1946. No explanation was provided, no forwarding records existed. The last entry simply read, "Conditions no longer permit standard operations." The Mira Ellwood file resurfaced not through official channels, but through the persistent inquiries of a retired cartographer who had been cross-referencing old forestry maps with modern satellite imagery. He noticed something peculiar. A cleared area, visible in aerial photographs from the early 1950s, showed unmistakable signs of human habitation, building foundations, a rough grid pattern suggesting planned infrastructure, and what appeared to be remnants of a small airstrip. Yet no settlement by that name, or any name, was listed in the territorial records for that region. When he brought his findings to the provincial archives, they conducted a deeper search. That search produced the ledger. The ledger itself was unremarkable in appearance. Standard government-issue binding, water-stained pages, and ink that had faded unevenly across the entries. What made it remarkable was what it described. Mira Ellwood had been a resource monitoring outpost, established to track timber quality, wildlife migration patterns, and potential mineral deposits in an area that had, until then, remained almost entirely uncharted. The settlement had housed between 12 and 17 individuals at any given time, though the ledger's personnel records were inconsistent. Some names appeared for only a few weeks before vanishing from the logs entirely. Others remained listed long after their reported departure dates. The handwriting changed frequently, suggesting multiple record keepers, but no signatures or identifications were attached to any of the entries. Initial reports described Mira Ellwood as a functioning, if isolated, operation. Supplies arrived by float plane during the summer months and by ski-equipped aircraft during winter. Radio transmissions were sent twice weekly to a regional coordination office, though the exact location of that office was never specified in the recovered documents. The settlement's physical layout, as described in the ledger, included a main administrative cabin, 4 residential structures, a storage depot, a radio station, and a small infirmary. The residents were a mix of surveyors, forestry technicians, a medical officer, a cook, and rotating support staff. According to supply requisition forms found tucked inside the ledger, conditions were described as austere but manageable. Then, in late January of 1946, the tone of the entries shifted. The weather observations became erratic. Temperatures were recorded multiple times per day with conflicting readings. Snowfall measurements appeared to contradict one another within the span of hours. personnel movements became harder to track. One entry noted that 3 individuals had departed for a survey expedition to the northern lakeshore, but provided no return date. A later entry, written in different handwriting, stated that those same 3 individuals were present and accounted for, with no mention of the expedition. Another entry mentioned the arrival of an unscheduled supply flight, but no flight log or cargo manifest was included. By early February, the entries became sparse and increasingly cryptic. The final weeks of documented activity at Mira Ellwood contained references to equipment malfunctions, disrupted radio schedules, and unexplained absences. One entry described the discovery of boot prints leading away from the settlement into the forest, prints that circled back toward the main cabin but never reached it. Another mentioned the disappearance of an entire set of survey maps from a locked filing cabinet. A third noted that the medical officer had requested an immediate evacuation due to unspecified health concerns among the residents, but no evacuation was recorded. The last entry, dated February 19, 1946, was a single line written in careful block letters: "Conditions no longer permit standard operations." Below that line, the ledger was blank. No closure report, no transfer documentation, no records of personnel reassignment or settlement decommissioning. The file simply ended. When provincial archivists attempted to locate follow-up records, they found nothing. The regional coordination office that Mira Ellwood had reported to no longer existed. The flight companies that had serviced the settlement had long since dissolved. The individuals listed in the personnel logs could not be traced through any existing databases. It was as if Mira Ellwood had been methodically erased from every record except the single ledger that had survived by chance. Efforts to locate the settlement's exact coordinates proved difficult. The forestry maps referenced in the ledger used a grid system that had been replaced decades earlier. The cartographer who had first noticed the site worked for months to triangulate its position using landmark descriptions and water pattern analysis. He eventually pinpointed a likely location near the edge of a provincial wilderness preserve, roughly 400 kilometers northwest of the nearest maintained road. Satellite imagery showed faint linear patterns in the forest canopy that could be remnants of the airstrip and building sites. Ground expeditions to the area, however, yielded little. The forest had reclaimed the land almost entirely. A few rotted timber fragments were discovered, along with scattered pieces of rusted metal that could have been parts of tools, stoves, or structural supports. Nothing definitive. Nothing that conclusively proved the settlement had been where the cartographer believed it to be. The site was remote, difficult to access, and surrounded by terrain that became impassable for most of the year. Researchers who visited the area described it as unnaturally quiet. No bird calls, no animal tracks, just endless boreal forest beneath a sky that seemed lower than it should have been. The case file remained officially unresolved. Provincial authorities classified Mira Ellwood as a discontinued operations site with insufficient documentation for historical designation. No memorial was erected. No further investigations were authorized. The ledger was returned to the archives, where it sat for years in a storage box labeled Miscellaneous Territorial Records. It was not until a documentary researcher, combing through Cold War-era government projects, stumbled upon a reference to Mira Ellwood in a declassified memo that the case attracted renewed attention. The memo, dated 1953, mentioned the settlement in passing as part of a broader review of remote monitoring stations established during and immediately after the war. The memo noted that Mira Ellwood had been decommissioned due to logistical complications and provided no additional details. Mira Ellwood was situated in a region where the boreal forest stretched unbroken for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. The settlement had been established on a narrow plateau between two elongated lakes, both of which remained frozen for more than half the year. The terrain was uneven, marked by low ridges of exposed bedrock, dense stands of black spruce and jack pine, and scattered areas of muskeg that thawed into treacherous marshland during the brief summer months. Accessibility was limited. The only reliable means of reaching the settlement was by air, and even that depended on favorable weather conditions. Fog rolled in without warning. Storms could ground aircraft for days. During winter, the cold was absolute. Temperatures regularly dropped below -30 degrees Celsius, and wind chill made exposure fatal within minutes. It was not a place where mistakes were forgiven. Survival required preparation, discipline, and an acceptance of isolation that few were equipped to handle. The lakes that flanked the settlement were described in the ledger as Mira Lakes, so named because their surfaces, when frozen, reflected the sky with such clarity that it became difficult to distinguish horizon from ice. The northern lake was larger and deeper, its far shore barely visible even on clear days. The southern lake was narrower, more irregular in shape, with several small islands that became accessible only when the ice was thick enough to support foot traffic. Between the lakes, the plateau rose just high enough to provide a vantage point over the surrounding forest. From the main cabin, observers could see for kilometers in every direction, though there was little to see except trees and snow. The nearest known settlement of any kind was more than 200 kilometers to the southeast, a logging camp that operated seasonally and had been abandoned by the late 1940s. Beyond that, there was nothing. No roads, no trails, no infrastructure of any kind. Mira Ellwood existed in a pocket of wilderness that had remained largely untouched by human activity until the settlement was established, and it returned to that state almost immediately after the settlement was abandoned. The region's weather patterns were extreme and unpredictable. Winter began in early October and lasted until late April, sometimes extending into May. Snowfall was heavy, often accumulating to depths that buried ground-level structures entirely. The sun, during the deepest part of winter, barely cleared the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the frozen lakes and into the forest. Daylight hours shrank to a brief window of pale grey light that did little to warm the landscape. Nights were long, cold, and profoundly dark. The settlement's residents relied on kerosene lamps and wood stoves for heat and light, both of which required constant attention. Fuel supplies were finite. If a resupply flight was delayed, rationing became necessary. The ledger contained several entries documenting fuel consumption rates and expressing concern over dwindling reserves. One entry, dated mid-January, noted that if the next scheduled flight did not arrive within 10 days, heating would need to be restricted to the main cabin and infirmary only. There is no record of whether that flight arrived. Wildlife in the area was sparse but present. Moose tracks were occasionally noted near the southern lake. Wolves were heard at night, though sightings were rare. Smaller animals, hares, foxes, martens, left traces in the snow, but hunting them required time and effort that the settlement's personnel could not always afford. Food supplies were brought in with each resupply flight, primarily non-perishable goods: canned meats, dried beans, flour, powdered milk, coffee, and sugar. Fresh food was a luxury. The cook's entries in the ledger occasionally mentioned attempts to supplement rations by fishing through the ice, though success was inconsistent. One entry described pulling up a line to find the bait untouched and the hook frozen solid. Another mentioned catching a single pike that fed 4 people for 2 days. The isolation weighed on everyone. The ledger's tone, even in its most routine entries, carried an undercurrent of tension. Cabin fever was mentioned twice, though never elaborated upon. Interpersonal conflicts were alluded to but not detailed. A note dated late January mentioned reassigning sleeping quarters to reduce friction, but the names involved were not specified. The settlement's infrastructure was minimal but functional. The main cabin served as the administrative center, housing the radio equipment, filing cabinets, and a work area for processing survey data. The residential structures were small, each designed to house 3 to 4 individuals in cramped quarters. Heat was provided by individual wood stoves, which meant each building required its own supply of firewood. Gathering and splitting wood was a daily task, one that became increasingly difficult as temperatures dropped and daylight hours diminished. The storage depot held supplies, tools, and emergency equipment. It was described in the ledger as well organized, with shelves labeled and inventory tracked meticulously. The radio station was a separate structure, insulated against the cold and equipped with a diesel generator that required regular maintenance. Radio transmissions were the settlement's only link to the outside world, and maintaining that link was treated as a priority. When transmissions began to falter in early February, it was noted immediately. The infirmary was the smallest structure, barely large enough for 2 cots and a medical supply cabinet. The medical officer's entries in the ledger were brief and clinical, noting minor injuries, frostbite cases, and occasional bouts of respiratory illness. Nothing that suggested a crisis, nothing that explained what happened later. The forest itself was described in the ledger with a kind of reluctant respect. It was referred to as dense, silent, and unforgiving. Trees grew close together, their branches interlocking overhead to create a canopy that blocked much of the sky. Visibility within the forest was limited. Trails had to be marked carefully to avoid becoming lost, and even marked trails could become obscured by snowfall within hours. The ledger contained multiple warnings about venturing into the forest alone. One entry described a surveyor who had wandered off-trail to investigate what he believed was a game path and became disoriented. He was found several hours later, less than 200 meters from the settlement, unable to explain how he had lost his bearings. The shift in tone within the ledger began subtly, almost imperceptibly, in the 3rd week of January. Routine entries about weather observations and supply levels were interspersed with brief, unexplained notes. Equipment that had been functioning properly was suddenly reported as malfunctioning. A compass that had been reliable for months began giving inconsistent readings. A surveyor's theodolite, calibrated just days earlier, produced measurements that did not align with known reference points. The radio transmissions, previously sent on a strict schedule every Monday and Thursday evening, began to arrive late or not at all. When questioned by the Regional Coordination Office, the settlement's radio operator attributed the irregularities to atmospheric interference, a plausible explanation given the region's latitude and the time of year. No further concern was raised. Then, on January 24th, an entry appeared that stood apart from the others in both tone and content. It read, "Tracks observed leading from storage depot to Southern Lake. No personnel unaccounted for. Tracks do not correspond to known boot patterns. No follow-up." 2 days later, another entry. 3 individuals departed 0800 hours for Northern Lakeshore Survey. Expected return by 1500 hours. The next entry, dated the following day, made no mention of their return. Instead, it stated, "All personnel present and accounted for." No reference to the survey, no explanation. When cross-referenced with the personnel log, the 3 individuals listed as having departed were also listed as being present at the settlement on the same day they were supposedly conducting the survey. The handwriting in the 2 entries was different, suggesting 2 different record keepers, but neither provided clarification. It was as if 2 separate realities had been documented simultaneously, with no acknowledgement of the contradiction. Over the following days, similar inconsistencies multiplied. Personnel were listed as being in 2 places at once. Tasks were recorded as completed before they were assigned. Weather observations noted clear skies, while other entries from the same day described heavy snowfall. The ledger began to read less like a record of daily operations and more like fragments of unrelated accounts stitched together without coherence. On February 1st, the medical officer made an entry that broke from his usual clinical brevity. He wrote, "Multiple residents reporting disorientation and persistent headaches. No clear medical cause identified. Recommend temporary evacuation for evaluation." The recommendation was noted, but not acted upon. No evacuation was arranged. No further medical entries appeared. Instead, the next entry came from the radio operator, who reported that outgoing transmissions were being received, but that incoming messages were garbled and unintelligible. He noted that the equipment had been inspected and found to be in working order. The problem, he suggested, was external. He did not elaborate. 3 days later, an entry described the disappearance of an entire set of survey maps from a locked filing cabinet in the main cabin. The maps had been used the previous day and returned to storage. When they were needed again, the cabinet was still locked, but the maps were gone. No signs of forced entry, no indication of who might have taken them or why. The entry concluded, "Maps considered lost. No further action." On February 7th, an entry appeared that would later become one of the most scrutinized passages in the entire ledger. It read, "Boot prints discovered leading from main cabin toward forest. Prints circle settlement perimeter 3 times before heading directly into tree line. Prints do not return. Search conducted. No personnel missing. Prints do not match any issued boots." The entry was unsigned. The handwriting was steady, deliberate, and unfamiliar. None of the other entries in the ledger matched it. No explanation was offered for how prints could exist without a corresponding person. No speculation was recorded. The matter was simply documented and left unresolved. 2 days later, another entry. Northern lake ice showing irregular fracture patterns. Ice thickness measured at 40 centimeters. Fractures inconsistent with temperature fluctuations. Avoid Northern Lake until further notice. The warning was repeated in 3 subsequent entries, each time with increased urgency, though no explanation was given for what made the fractures irregular or why they posed a danger. By mid-February, the ledger's entries became sparse and fragmented. Days passed with no recorded activity. When entries did appear, they were brief and cryptic. February 12th. Generator failure. Repairs attempted. Unsuccessful. February 14th. Rations inventoried. Discrepancy noted. No further details. February 16th. Radio contact lost. Cause unknown. The final entry, dated February 19th, consisted of a single sentence. Conditions no longer permit standard operations. Below that, the ledger was blank. No signatures, no closure notes, no indication of what had happened to the residents, the equipment, or the settlement itself. The page was clean, as if the writer had intended to continue, but had been interrupted, or had chosen not to. The ledger ended there, and so did the official record of Mira Ellwood. What makes the incident at Mira Ellwood particularly difficult to reconstruct is the absence of any external corroboration. The Regional Coordination Office, which should have maintained records of all communications with the settlement, no longer existed by the time the case was reopened. The flight companies that serviced the area had dissolved, and their records, if they had ever existed, were lost. None of the individuals listed in the personnel log could be traced. Their names did not appear in any government employment records, military service files, or civilian registries. It was as if they had never existed at all. The settlement itself, when finally located by the cartographer decades later, yielded almost no physical evidence. The structures had collapsed or been dismantled. The airstrip was overgrown. The forest had reclaimed the land so completely that it was difficult to believe anyone had ever lived there. The only items recovered from the site were a few rusted tools, a fragment of a kerosene lamp, and a single page torn from a different ledger, one that was never part of the archive file. The initial investigation into Mira Ellwood, if it can be called that, was conducted not by law enforcement or government officials, but by archivists attempting to make sense of the fragmented ledger. Their work was hampered by the lack of supporting documentation, the absence of any official closure report, and the sheer remoteness of the settlement's suspected location. The first challenge was verifying that Mira Ellwood had existed at all. The ledger provided descriptions of the settlement, its personnel and its operations, but no external records confirmed any of it. The Regional Coordination Office that had supposedly overseen the settlement could not be located in any government directory. The flight companies mentioned in supply requisition forms had no surviving business records. Even the territorial maps that should have shown the settlement's location made no reference to it. For all practical purposes, Mira Ellwood existed only in the pages of a single water-stained ledger. That alone made the case unusual, but it was the inconsistencies within the ledger itself that made it deeply unsettling. Archivists noted that the handwriting changed frequently, sometimes mid-entry, suggesting that multiple individuals had been responsible for maintaining the log. In some cases, entries from the same day were written in different hands, with conflicting information and no acknowledgement of the discrepancies. Dates were sometimes out of sequence. An entry dated February 10th appeared 3 pages after an entry dated February 12th. Weather observations recorded clear skies on the same day that another entry described a blizzard. Personnel listed as absent were simultaneously listed as present. An archivist described the ledger as reading like a palimpsest, a document that had been overwritten multiple times without fully erasing the previous text. Except in this case, the overwriting was not physical but informational. It was as if 2 or more versions of events were being recorded simultaneously, with no effort to reconcile them. The result was a document that felt unstable, unreliable, and yet disturbingly specific in its details. Efforts to locate the individuals listed in the personnel log were unsuccessful. The names themselves were common enough, surnames like Thompson, Harris, Caldwell, but none of them matched any existing records. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, military enlistment papers, and employment histories were all checked. Nothing. One archivist suggested that the names might have been pseudonyms used to protect the identities of individuals involved in a classified or sensitive project. But no evidence of such a project could be found. Another possibility was that the records had been deliberately destroyed, either to protect the individuals involved or to erase the settlement's existence entirely. But if that were the case, why had the ledger survived? Why leave behind a single, incomplete document that raised more questions than it answered? The archivists had no satisfactory explanation. The case simply refused to resolve into anything coherent. The cartographer who had first identified the settlement's probable location conducted his own investigation. Using the forestry maps referenced in the ledger, he spent months triangulating coordinates, cross-referencing watershed patterns, and analyzing satellite imagery. His work was meticulous, and he eventually identified a site that matched the ledger's descriptions. The site was located within a provincial wilderness preserve, in an area that was officially designated as undeveloped and inaccessible except by air or on foot during the brief summer months. He shared his findings with provincial authorities, who authorized a preliminary survey expedition. The expedition, conducted in late summer, when the terrain was most accessible, reached the site after 3 days of difficult travel. What they found was inconclusive. Faint depressions in the ground suggested where structures might have stood. Linear patterns in the vegetation hinted at an old airstrip. But there were no standing buildings, no intact foundations, and very few artifacts. The few items recovered, rusted metal fragments, rotted timber, a shard of glass, could have come from any number of sources. Nothing definitively proved that the site had been Mira Ellwood. One discovery, however, stood out. Near what was believed to be the location of the main cabin, the survey team found a shallow depression filled with charred wood and ash. The depression was roughly circular, about 2 meters in diameter, and surrounded by a ring of stones that appeared to have been deliberately placed. The arrangement suggested a fire pit, but there was no indication of when it had been used or by whom. More puzzling was the condition of the surrounding ground. While the rest of the site showed typical signs of decades of weathering and forest encroachment, the area around the fire pit was strangely barren. No moss, no lichen, no vegetation of any kind. The soil itself appeared discolored, almost grey, and had a texture that one team member described as powdery. Samples were collected and sent for analysis, but the results were inconclusive. The soil showed elevated levels of certain minerals, but nothing that explained its unusual appearance or the absence of plant growth. The fire pit itself remained unexplained. It was noted in the survey report and then set aside as a curiosity, one of many unexplained details in a case full of them. Attempts to locate records from the flight companies that had serviced the settlement proved fruitless. The companies in question had operated during the immediate post-war period, a time of rapid expansion and equally rapid contraction in the aviation industry. Many small operators had gone out of business within a few years, their records lost or discarded. Of the 2 companies mentioned in the ledger's supply requisition forms, one had no surviving documentation at all. The other had a single surviving ledger of its own, kept by a former pilot who had worked for the company in the 1940s. That pilot, located in the late 1980s, was elderly, and his memory was fragmentary. He recalled flying supply runs to remote outposts in the Northern Territories, but he could not specifically remember a place called Mira Ellwood. When shown the ledger, he studied it for a long time before saying that the handwriting looked familiar, though he could not say why. He mentioned that some of the flights he had made during that period were not logged officially, either because they were last-minute additions to his schedule or because the clients had requested discretion. He suggested that Mira Ellwood might have been one of those off-the-books operations. He could not provide any details. He died less than a year after the interview, taking whatever knowledge he might have had with him. The most significant lead came not from the archives or the survey expedition, but from a marginal note discovered in a declassified government memo. The memo, part of a broader review of wartime and post-war resource monitoring programs, mentioned Mira Ellwood in a single paragraph. The paragraph was brief and unrevealing, noting only that the settlement had been decommissioned due to logistical complications and that personnel status was unverified. The memo was dated 1953, 7 years after the ledger's final entry. The handwritten annotation in the margin, personnel status unverified, suggested that someone at some point had attempted to determine what had happened to the settlement's residents and had been unable to do so. The annotation was not expanded upon. No follow-up documents existed. The memo itself had been filed away and forgotten, part of a routine declassification process that released thousands of pages of bureaucratic correspondence into the public domain. It was only by chance that a researcher, combing through those documents for an unrelated project, noticed the reference and brought it to the attention of the archivists working on the Mira Ellwood case. The memo provided no answers, but it confirmed that the settlement had existed, that it had been officially recognized at some point, and that its closure had been considered unusual enough to warrant a comment, even if that comment was never followed up on. One of the most persistent questions surrounding Mira Ellwood is why the settlement was established in the first place. According to the ledger, its purpose was to monitor timber quality, wildlife migration patterns, and potential mineral deposits. But the location was remote even by northern standards, and the resources required to maintain a settlement in such an isolated area would have been considerable. The cost-benefit analysis did not make sense. The region's timber was no different from timber found in more accessible areas. Wildlife migration patterns could have been monitored from existing posts. And if mineral deposits were suspected, initial surveys could have been conducted without establishing a permanent settlement. So why Mira Ellwood? One theory, never confirmed, was that the settlement served a secondary purpose, one that was not documented in the ledger. The absence of a clear explanation for what happened at Mira Ellwood has led to numerous theories, none of which fully account for the evidence or lack thereof. The simplest explanation is that the settlement was abandoned due to logistical failures. The region's harsh conditions, combined with unreliable resupply flights and equipment malfunctions, could have made continued operation untenable. When conditions deteriorated to the point where safety could no longer be guaranteed, the residents may have been evacuated, and the settlement was quietly decommissioned. The lack of documentation could be attributed to bureaucratic oversight, record-keeping failures, or a deliberate decision to avoid drawing attention to a failed project. This theory is plausible, but it does not explain the inconsistencies in the ledger, the contradictory personnel records, or the cryptic nature of the final entries. It also does not account for the inability to trace any of the individuals listed in the personnel log. If the settlement had been evacuated in an orderly fashion, there should be records of where the residents went, what happened to the equipment, and why the site was abandoned so completely. Another theory suggests that the settlement experienced a medical emergency that was not fully documented. The medical officer's entry in early February, noting disorientation and persistent headaches among multiple residents, could indicate the onset of a contagious illness, carbon monoxide poisoning from faulty stoves, or some other environmental hazard. If the situation escalated rapidly, an emergency evacuation might have been carried out without time to update the ledger or file the appropriate reports. This theory would explain the abrupt end to the ledger's entries and the lack of closure documentation. However, it does not explain why no evacuation was recorded by the Regional Coordination Office, why the flight companies have no records of emergency flights, or why none of the residents could be traced afterward. If a medical emergency had occurred, there should be hospital records, quarantine reports, or at the very least, some indication that a crisis had taken place. None of those records exist. A third theory, less grounded in logistical or medical explanations, focuses on the psychological effects of extreme isolation. The northern wilderness, especially during the winter months, imposes a psychological burden that is difficult to overstate. The absence of sunlight, the relentless cold, the monotony of daily routines, and the complete lack of contact with the outside world can lead to a condition sometimes referred to as polar madness or cabin fever. Symptoms include paranoia, hallucinations, irrational behavior, and in extreme cases, complete psychological breakdown. The ledger's increasingly erratic entries could be interpreted as evidence of this deterioration. The conflicting accounts, the unexplained disappearances and reappearances of personnel, the cryptic warnings about boot prints and ice fractures, all of these could be manifestations of a collective psychological collapse. According to this theory, the settlement did not experience a single catastrophic event, but rather a gradual unraveling, as the residents lost their ability to maintain coherent records or even to distinguish reality from hallucination. Eventually, they may have abandoned the settlement in a state of confusion, either perishing in the wilderness or scattering in different directions, leaving no trace. This theory is compelling in its way, but it requires accepting that multiple individuals, all trained professionals, experience simultaneous and nearly identical psychological breakdowns, and that their descent into irrationality was documented in the ledger in real time, without any of them recognizing what was happening. Some researchers have proposed that the inconsistencies in the ledger are not evidence of psychological breakdown, but of something more deliberate. According to this theory, the ledger was never intended to be a straightforward record of events. Instead, it may have been a form of coded communication, with the contradictions and cryptic entries serving as a cipher that could be read by someone with the appropriate key. If Mira Ellwood was involved in a classified project, as some have speculated, the ledger might have been designed to appear innocuous to casual observers while conveying critical information to authorized personnel. The problem with this theory is that no cipher has ever been identified. Cryptographic experts who have examined the ledger found no consistent patterns, no hidden messages, and no evidence of encoding. If the ledger was a cipher, it was either so sophisticated that it has defied analysis for decades, or it was not a cipher at all. The theory remains speculative and unsupported. Another line of speculation, less frequently discussed in official contexts, revolves around the environment itself. The region where Mira Ellwood was located is part of the vast boreal shield, an area characterized by ancient bedrock, deep forests, and geological formations that have remained largely unchanged for millennia. Some researchers have suggested that certain areas within the boreal shield exhibit unusual properties, magnetic anomalies, localized atmospheric disturbances, or other phenomena that are not yet fully understood. These properties, according to the theory, could have affected the settlement's equipment, disrupted radio communications, and even influenced the mental state of the residents. The theory points to the compass malfunctions noted in the ledger, the irregular ice fractures on the northern lake, and the strange clearing in the forest that was discovered and then avoided. If the area around Mira Ellwood was subject to some form of environmental anomaly, it might explain the equipment failures and the disorientation reported by the residents. However, this theory veers into speculation and has no empirical support. No subsequent studies of the region have identified any unusual properties. The area is remote and difficult to access, which may explain why such studies have been limited, but the absence of evidence cannot be used to support a theory based on unverified phenomena. A small subset of researchers operating outside the mainstream have suggested that the case of Mira Ellwood may be connected to other unsolved disappearances in the Northern Territories. Over the decades, there have been numerous reports of individuals, small groups, and even entire settlements vanishing without explanation in remote areas of Canada's north. While most of these cases can be attributed to harsh conditions, navigational errors, or simple misfortune, a few remain stubbornly inexplicable. Proponents of this theory argue that there may be a pattern, a commonality among these disappearances that has not yet been recognized. They point to recurring elements: the remoteness of the locations, the lack of physical evidence, the absence of bodies, and the presence of contradictory or incomplete records. According to this theory, Mira Ellwood is not an isolated incident, but part of a larger, still unresolved phenomenon. Critics of this theory note that drawing connections between unrelated cases based on superficial similarities is a form of pattern seeking that can lead to false conclusions. Without concrete evidence linking the cases, the theory remains speculative and unverifiable, What remains consistent across all theories is the recognition that the case of Mira Ellwood defies easy explanation. The evidence is too fragmentary, too contradictory, and too incomplete to support any single conclusion. The ledger, the only surviving document, raises more questions than it answers. The physical site, when finally located, offered almost no clues. The individuals involved left no trace. The official records, such as they were, provided only the barest acknowledgement that the settlement had existed at all. It is a case built almost entirely on absence of evidence, absence of records, absence of people, and yet that absence itself is evidence of something. Something happened at Mira Ellwood in the winter of 1946. The file on Mira Ellwood remains open, though no active investigation is underway. The ledger sits in a provincial archive, available to researchers but rarely consulted. The site itself, if it was correctly identified, lies deep within a wilderness preserve, visited only occasionally by hikers or survey teams with no knowledge of what may have stood there decades ago. The individuals listed in the personnel log have never been found, and at this point, it is unlikely they ever will be. Too much time has passed. Too many records have been lost. Whatever happened during that winter in 1946 has been buried beneath decades of snow, silence, and bureaucratic neglect. The case has become one of those historical footnotes that occasionally resurfaces when someone stumbles upon the ledger or hears a reference to the settlement in an obscure document. But it never gains enough traction to warrant a full-scale investigation. There are too many gaps, too many missing pieces, and perhaps in the end, that is what makes the case so unsettling. It is not the presence of something strange or inexplicable. It is the absence of answers where answers should exist. One of the enduring questions is why the settlement was allowed to simply disappear. Frontier outposts, even remote ones, were tracked by multiple agencies. Supplies had to be authorized and delivered. Personnel had to be hired, paid, and eventually reassigned. There were systems in place, bureaucratic mechanisms designed to ensure that nothing fell through the cracks. And yet, Mira Ellwood did. It fell not just through the cracks, but into a kind of informational void, as if the systems designed to track it had malfunctioned or been deliberately circumvented. The declassified memo from 1953 suggests that at least one official had noticed the discrepancy, had noted that personnel status was unverified, but nothing came of it. The matter was acknowledged and then set aside. Whether that was due to incompetence, indifference, or something more intentional is impossible to say. The memo provides no context. It is a fragment, like everything else in this case. A fragment without a whole. The cartographer who first identified the settlement's location continued his work for years, driven by a conviction that the truth could be uncovered if enough effort was applied. He conducted additional surveys, cross-referenced more maps, and interviewed anyone who might have had even a tangential connection to the region during the 1940s. His efforts yielded little. The few people he found who had worked in the Northern Territories during that period were elderly, their memories vague and unreliable. Some recalled hearing about a settlement that had been abandoned, but none could provide specific details. A former pilot, interviewed shortly before his death, mentioned flying over an area where he had seen smoke rising from a cluster of buildings in the winter of 1946. He had assumed it was a logging camp or a trapping station. He never investigated further. He could not remember exactly where the site had been, only that it was northwest of a particular lake, a lake that had since been renamed and no longer appeared on modern maps with the name he remembered. The cartographer followed up on the lead, but the information was too imprecise. He never found the site the pilot described. He died in the early 2000s, leaving behind boxes of notes, maps, and correspondence. His work was donated to the same provincial archive that held the ledger. It sits there now, another collection of fragments that may or may not be connected to Mira Ellwood. The question of what to do with the case has been debated periodically by archivists, historians, and researchers. Some argue that it should be formally closed, classified as an unsolved historical mystery with insufficient evidence for further investigation. Others believe that advances in technology, satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, DNA analysis of recovered artifacts, might eventually provide new insights. A few have suggested that the ledger itself should be subjected to more rigorous forensic analysis. The ink could be dated, the paper could be analyzed, the handwriting could be compared to known samples from other government documents of the period. These are all reasonable suggestions, but they require funding, institutional support, and a level of interest that the case has never generated. Mira Ellwood is not famous. It is not a case that captures public imagination or attracts media attention. It is obscure, difficult to explain, and frustratingly unresolved. As a result, it remains where it has always been, filed away, noted, but not pursued. For those who have studied the case, however, it leaves an impression that is difficult to shake. There is something about the ledger's final entry, "Conditions no longer permit standard operations," that feels like an understatement so profound that it verges on the absurd. What conditions? What operations? The sentence is maddeningly vague, offering no explanation, while simultaneously suggesting that an explanation exists, or existed, and was simply not recorded. It is the kind of sentence that invites speculation, that demands interpretation, but provides no guidance for how to interpret it. It is a door that has been closed but not locked, a question that has been asked but not answered. And perhaps that is the most unsettling aspect of the entire case, not what happened, but the sense that someone, somewhere, knew what happened and chose not to document it, or documented it in a way that was deliberately opaque, or documented it and then ensured that the documentation would never be found. The site itself, the physical location where Mira Ellwood once stood, remains as it was found, silent, reclaimed by the forest, offering no answers. The structures that once housed a dozen or more people have collapsed into the earth. The airstrip that once connected the settlement to the outside world is buried beneath decades of vegetation. The lakes that flank the settlement freeze and thaw with the seasons, their surfaces reflecting the sky as they always have, indifferent to the questions that remain unanswered. In winter, the site is inaccessible. In summer, it is difficult to reach and offers little to see. It is a place where something happened, but what that something was has been erased so thoroughly that it is almost as if it never happened at all. Almost. The ledger remains. The memo remains. The memories of a few elderly individuals, now deceased, remain in the form of interview transcripts. These fragments persist, not enough to solve the case, but enough to ensure that it is not entirely forgotten. The case of Mira Ellwood is one of absence. Absence of people, absence of records, absence of explanation. It is a void in the historical record, a gap that resists being filled. And in the northern wilderness, where silence is the default and the landscape offers no answers, such voids are not uncommon. What is uncommon is that this particular void was documented. Someone, at some point, sat down and wrote in a ledger that conditions no longer permitted standard operations. And then they stopped writing. Whatever they knew, whatever they saw, whatever they experienced, they chose not to record. Or they recorded it, and the record was lost. Or the record exists somewhere, misfiled or forgotten, waiting to be discovered by someone who knows where to look.